Hey everybody, welcome. I'm so excited to be here for those of you who are joining us. We are here today to talk about zoonosis, pandemics, and World Animal Protection's campaign that calls for an end to the global wildlife trade ahead of world leaders gathering for the G20 summit, which is coming up in November. So let me introduce myself. My name is Aliya Jasmine. I'm a television host and producer and environmental journalist. At the start of the pandemic, I did a story about the link between the illegal wildlife trade and COVID-19 that got worldwide attention, and many of you may have seen some of my work on NBC News, the Discovery Channel, MTV News, among others. I currently live and work as a reporter here in Los Angeles, but my nationality is actually Canadian. I sit on the board of Nature United, which is the Canadian chapter of the Nature Conservancy. I was also just accepted as a fellow to the Canadian Geographic Society, and I am a global wildlife ambassador for World Animal Protection. So I'm excited to be here. I am very, very much looking forward to diving in deeper into this issue about zoonotic diseases. And I'm sure all of you are excited to come join us as well. I encourage you to ask questions. This is a conversation with all of us, but it cannot happen without our special guest and expert. Joining me is the head of wildlife research and animal welfare at World Animal Protection, Dr. Neil DeCruz. He uses data to inform the development and implementation of practical solutions to reduce the unnecessary suffering of wild animals, as well as protected animal populations who are living in the wild. His efforts have actually helped improve the welfare and conservation status of species in over 40 countries and across 6 continents. And for all of you academic nerds watching, I encourage you to check out any one of his 50 peer-reviewed scientific articles. Welcome, Dr. Neil.
Hi, Aliya, Jasmine. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here.
So first of all, what time is it in your part of the world?
It's just past 7 o'clock in the evening here in London.
Well, good evening to you. It is 11 a.m. here in Los Angeles. So I love that we are able to communicate with each other about an issue that's affecting us in both parts of our world and indeed all over the world. So again, thank you so much for doing this publicly with everybody. Let me start by saying this. At the beginning of the pandemic, I did this story, right, about pangolins and the link that this animal, which many people didn't know was, the most, one of the most, if not the most trafficked mammal in the world, let alone, most people don't even know what a pangolin is. So I did this story and it got a lot of attention. I really want to dig deeper into this illegal wildlife trade. In your professional opinion, is the wildlife trade responsible for the pandemic that we are currently living through?
Yeah, I guess just to begin from the outset, I think there's no question at the moment about whether or not wildlife trade is front and center at the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic that we're all currently living through. But before I come back to that, there are increasing questions about where and when COVID-19 originated and what animals were involved. And to give some examples, as you mentioned earlier, Jasmine, pangolins, these kind of scaly, small domesticated cat-sized mammals were front and center early on, but so were snakes at one point in time. And now it's kind of circled back to bats, and they are now suspected to be the most likely, kind of evolutionary host for COVID-19. And the reason why it can be so difficult to nail down which animal was actually involved is because, in many cases, a virus such as COVID-19 will use other animals as stepping stones in a process, probably in this situation, kind of the recombination of the virus. So the virus basically it kind of has a genetic switch around as it's passed from these different animal species to get to a point where it's able to actually infect a human cell, and then humans are able to pass the virus on to other humans, which is the situation, of course, which we have now with COVID-19. So lots of different animals have been implicated. Bats, and I can maybe speak some more about bats later, about why they're particularly prominent when it comes to zoonotic disease transfer. But no, wildlife trade itself is definitely front and center of the process and where COVID-19 originated.
And you touched on this, but I think this is really interesting. If you've studied human history and the way that human evolution has happened with agriculture and farming, you know that zoonotic diseases did not start with COVID-19. I mean, this is something that we as humans have endured for a very, very long time. Can you tell me a little bit about that? For those people who are watching who may not know the history of zoonotic diseases, tell us a little bit about this.
Sure. I mean, COVID-19 is not the first zoonotic disease. So a disease that can be spread between animals and humans, and back the other way, we can pass zoonotic diseases back to animals. There's a long history, and one of the most kind of cited studies looked at the number of emerging infectious diseases. So those are the diseases that come from animals and don't come from animals. And between 1914 and 2004, they found over 300 different zoonotic emerging infectious diseases coming from hundreds of different pathogens. And what they found was that over 52% of those emerging infectious diseases were of animal origin. And then when you dive deeper into the zoonotic infectious diseases, 72% of those come from wild animals. The remainder coming from domesticated animals, so farmed animals, more traditionally. So, in short, wild animals have long been a recognized source of zoonotic diseases, and a lot of the biology behavior of the animals and our changing behavioral patterns, as human beings, as a species, is increasing the likelihood of zoonotic diseases happening in future and these kind of disease outbreaks.
Tell me why. Why is our behavior increasing the likelihood of these zoonotic diseases?
There's lots of things that we're doing. We are have the habitat destruction that's taking place, increasing the interface between people and animals. We are intensively farming domesticated animals, which is increasing the ability for the chances of zoonotic diseases emerging. But of course, what we're here to talk about today is the wildlife trade, and we're talking about now a global, billion-dollar industry, which involves a huge variety of different animal species used for a variety of different reasons: for entertainment, for tourism, for traditional medicine, for as exotic pets, as bushmeat. And we are now in a situation where where wildlife markets have kind of come front and center, where we can be as either for example, as a tourist, kind of directly, and in some cases deliberately going to a wildlife market to experience them. In some cases, just being close because they're in the center of an urban area where you're traveling, and then you can be on a plane the next day, and you can unintentionally, transmit a zoonotic disease, within days, and so. Yeah, the extent, the global scope and scale of the wildlife trade, the commodification of wild animals, and other aspects of modern life are just making the risk of zoonotic disease transmission just go off the charts.
Dr. Neil DeCruz, I'm getting a few. I know a lot of people are asking questions. We want you to keep asking questions in your comment section. I just got a DM that I think is really interesting of someone who's watching us live right now, and they said that if this isn't the first zoonotic disease, are they all caused by bats? And from my research, the answer is no. But can you talk? I mean, when you think about like the swine flu, for instance, or these other zoonotic diseases, I mean, these are all examples of these kind of things, right?
No, they're not. They're not all caused by bats. But bats do feature quite heavily, especially with coronaviruses. COVID-19 is one of a whole family of coronaviruses, and the reason why bats in particular have been implicated, we've got a long kind of cultural history as humans, globally with bats, but there's kind of key aspects of their biology which experts believe make them particularly prone to being involved with kind of zoonotic disease outbreaks. One is that they will tend to roost in, they're quite famous for roosting in high numbers. So you've got the ability for animals closely packed together to pass, for example, bacteria from one another. You've also got the fact that both fruit-eating bats and insectivorous bats, so those that eat insects, the locomotion of flight, they're eating on the move, so they aren't able to fully ingest and digest the food. So there's the ability to, almost like a Wild West, kind of Western, where they'll spit out part of the food. That enables other animals to eat it. There's a transmission pathway there for infection. And of course, we can be susceptible to zoonotic diseases by bats biting us, for example, rabies, but also for us essentially biting them and eating them or consuming them as food. So I guess the other bit as well with bats is that in some cases they hibernate. And if they do that, it gives the opportunity, for example, for a virus to survive a cold snap or a cold period that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to get through. So no, bats aren't, and it's very very important to highlight that bats aren't just bags of disease. They're very important animals that have a key part of the ecosystem, and I'm sure everyone is aware they're mammals, but the key thing is that there's aspects of their biology there that make them particularly prone. And as I said, you throw that into the fact that I myself have seen cages and cages of bats at markets intended for pets or as food. Just literally just bat droppings all over the cage, huddled together in really poor conditions, and you're just asking for trouble.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really good point. I mean, it's really not, regardless of the animal that may spread this zoonotic disease to humans, it's not the animal that's the issue. It's the way that the animals are kept, our proximity to those animals, the hygiene that they're kept in, right? I mean, what are some examples of zoonotic diseases that have happened in the past, and what were the animals that were implicated in those?
Sure. So, I mean, if you look at kind of the history of coronaviruses, SARS, so severe acute respiratory syndrome, and civets were highly implicated in another small kind of cat-sized mammal. Again, kind of going back from, there's multiple ways in which civets are traded. They're kept and sold as exotic pets. Another key thing that's really showed a boom in recent decades is civet coffee. So, in places like Bali, where people go on holiday, they will be asked to try civet coffee, which is where the animals are kept in cages with kind of really kind of terrible flooring, which is just these metal bars, which are labels. Once the animals have eaten coffee, berries or cherries, they will then do what animals will do, and the droppings will come through the bottom of the cage, and that's used to make this high-end $80 cup of coffee, and
poop coffee,
basically. Yeah, exactly. So you've got this situation where you've got animals just kept in terrible conditions. You're actively going through their poop, and again, you're increasing the chances for zoonotic disease transmission. As I said, they were implicated with SARS.
Okay, so we are getting a bunch of questions here on Facebook. I'm just going to read some of them. This is from Tim Smithman, who says, can you speak to what needs to be done, both from a global and domestic perspective, to help prevent the next pandemic? That's a great question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and it comes back to World Animal Protection's campaign, and why the G20 is being asked to commit to ending the global wildlife trade. And I mean, beyond pandemics, there's a whole raft of reasons why wildlife trade, commercial wildlife trade, is really bad for the animals themselves, for people, and for planet.
This isn't poop coffee, by the way, before we get
so there's a whole raft of reasons why wildlife trade is awful for wildlife, people, and planet, and the increasing chance of zoonotic disease is one which we're all unfortunately living and suffering through at the moment. But in addition, increasingly we're realizing that wildlife trade, although historically it was kind of viewed as it could put economic value on animals and it could help us to conserve them, recently global reports have shown that wildlife trade, and I'm very specifically here not saying illegal wildlife trade, I'm saying wildlife trade and exploitation, legal and illegal, is one of the second biggest drivers of species extinction. And as we know, we're heading into the 6th mass extinction, with a lot of some of the great documentaries that are coming out at the moment that really highlight that this isn't a drill anymore. This isn't just something that will happen in generations to come. This is something that we're living through and going to start seeing now and experience ourselves. And
it is. And
sorry,
go ahead. No, you please.
And I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, it's just making us realize now that complacency, we do need to shake it up. We need to do something beyond the status quo and what we've tried in the past. And and a commitment to the end of wildlife trade. It's going to be difficult, it's going to be hard, but the commitment is where it starts, and that's what we're asking for with this true leadership.
It's so interesting, right? I mean, that's exactly what I was going to say, was that the idea of ending the wildlife trade has been around for a very long time. World Animal Protection has been, and you in particular have been gathering data and doing this research, but this global pandemic has really brought this discussion into, quite literally, everyone's households, where now we are seeing a direct link of how this really impacts not only the wildlife out there who deserve to be free, but also us as humans in our species. So I'll get to another question here. This is from Bim Wilkes, who is on Facebook. How can we put more pressure on our government to help end this trade, as I feel this trade makes billions for certain countries, and they will not be keen on losing this revenue, because in the main, this trade is driven by corruption and money? That's a really good question, Doctor, because you did hit on this by saying this isn't just the illegal wildlife trade. This is all wildlife trade. And in some countries, indeed, things are more legal than in other countries. So how do we put this pressure on all governments, regardless of their individual value systems?
Well, what can you do right now this second is you can sign a petition, of course, and put the pressure on the G20. But yeah, I mean, I think as you've highlighted, it's not just illegal trade, it is legal. I mean, and again, just look at it in terms of the pandemic, right? As I mentioned earlier, the numbers are very difficult to put a key figure on, but we are talking billions of dollars every year globally for the legal wildlife trade, so that you're allowed to do. But that is dwarfed by the trillions that are being spent at the moment post-COVID. And as I said earlier, there's question marks about which species were involved and how and when and exactly, but the fact that wildlife trade is a looming threat and was heavily involved, is where this pandemic has come from, is not in doubt. And so yes, I think it's time, even if you completely discard the intrinsic value of the animals, the fact that they have, that they are sentient, that they can feel, emotions, and they are cognitive, and they can think and feel and learn. It's time, even if you're just a pure economist, the numbers are off the charts in terms of what it's costing us retrospectively to pay for the damage that the wildlife trade, if you take it as a whole.
So let's get to this question from Polly Pan, who just came through on Facebook. One major MLAP operator said they have conducted hundreds and hundreds of shows in front of hundreds of thousands of people, and not a single person ever has contracted anything. How on earth could they know that? Can you explain this question a little bit as well in your answer, Doctor?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we get this question a lot in terms of, be it an exotic pet exposition, be it a border checkpoint with a live animal consignment coming through. Surely we just increase biosecurity protocols, and in some cases they're stellar anyway, and they're fantastic and they're working. And the reality is, first of all, that animals may be sick and just not showing any symptoms, and so they may bypass. We're talking about huge numbers as well. For example, hundreds of animals in a consignment. If you're talking about something like an amphibian or a reptile, are they testing each and every one? Is it just one random sample? In addition, as we've highlighted, there's also emerging diseases that we've never even encountered before. So how are you able to test for something when you don't know what it is you're looking for? So ultimately, if you're really going to take a really cautionary approach to this, what's the best way of stopping the disease from coming across? Is to stop the animal being traded in the first place. And this is what the G20 petition ask is about. It's focusing on one of the key transmission pathways, which is wildlife trade markets have quite rightly been in the news and focus of a lot of conversations, but they're not the only stage of the trade chain. And it's this international commercial trade. We're not talking about for conservation purposes, so animals can be moved across borders for a sanctuary. We're talking about where animals are being moved in huge numbers, in terrible conditions, in many cases legally, for personal pleasure, profit, luxury. It's that element that we can just cut out and just have this massive impact, not only on the animals themselves, but also wild populations, and ultimately, even if you don't care about any of that.
Oh, That's my little foster puppy who's trying to get into the conversation, if you can hear him there. Okay, so I'm going to get to Cassandra's question here, but before I do, I do want to ask you something I'm seeing pop up from a lot of people, which is simply, why are more people not just making this link? I mean, taking wild animals from their habitats is obviously cruel, but as you said, it has horrible economic implications, even if you don't have that connection to wild animals. And in a very selfish level, it's actually hurting our species as humans, as we can now all see with this pandemic. So why are more people not making this link?
There's a whole range of different reasons. I think one of the first, I guess, is at the moment where many of us are just dealing with the fallout of COVID-19 in our own lives and struggling to kind of come to terms with that new reality. In addition, in some situations, it's actually their love of animals that's almost making them blind to that, to the suffering that's involved. In many cases, they won't see how the animal was sourced from the wild, how it was caught and captured and transported, how many died as a result, so that one could survive the trade chain, how they're packaged, how they're shipped, how they're treated like commodities. And in addition, and a very important part, which has direct relevance to the zoonosis aspect, is that in many cases, the solution to the kind of the conservation or sustainable use is to farm them commercially. So to pack wild animals into intensive, conditions and speed breed them in many cases to try and meet consumer demand. And what you're doing there is putting animals into poor welfare, stressful conditions, which lowers their immune system. And again, just it's another way of increasing the chances of zoonotic diseases being spread between individuals and potentially emerging. So in short, I think one key thing beyond us just kind of being removed from it is there is that risk that our desire to be close to wild animals and not seeing the full trade chain is maybe making us become involved with something that if we could see all those aspects, we would probably decide not to.
And I think that's especially important in this world of social media as we're all at home. Many of us are still isolating. Many of us are working from home. And you're seeing that on, for example, on Instagram or on social media, people are posting about these new animals that they got, whether it's like me fostering, a dog, but some people are also posting about these monkeys they've adopted or parrots that they've adopted. And I think it's really important, as you said, that sometimes realizing that people aren't inherently evil, it comes from a love of animals, and it's important to educate them that where did that monkey or parrot come from, right? And what was the implications of that? I think is really important.
Exactly, and I think it extends across the whole trade chain. This isn't about people, I think, necessarily being evil. It's about people misunderstanding animals, their biology, their behavior, what they need. And I had this conversation a lot with people, and but Neil, all of the animals survived the process. This animal has survived to a long. It's lived longer than it would have ever lived in the wild. But it's like there is a difference between surviving and thriving. There is a difference between actually having a good quality of life. And the reality is, unlike the puppy that you're fostering, wild animals have not gone through this domestication process of thousands of years of co-evolving with us to a point where they can cope in our living rooms. They are part of and parcel of our daily life. We're talking about animals which in many cases, there's no way you could come anywhere close to providing them with the range of experiences that will fully meet what their biology and behavior require. So there is that real distinction.
Yes, so for everyone watching who's thinking of getting a cute pet while they're at home, think about perhaps fostering a puppy or a cat or from your local shelter instead. Jenny Jahan says, why are you asking the G20 in particular? What if they don't listen?
The G20, because they are by definition, and allowed them be selected. They were influential. They were influential countries, and they had the ability to move very quickly and very fast as a result. And what they decide and recommend isn't necessarily legally binding from the start, but that also gives them the speed and the ability to quickly make decisions and to provide those recommendations. So, in short, highly influential group of countries there that could really make a difference. And so it's that commitment that will make a real difference.
I think this might also be really important to talk to you about as well. is the idea that a lot of this conversation that people have heard, a lot of awareness about, for example, wet markets has really emerged during this pandemic, right? And that is very often when we talk about like the wet markets in China, and there's certain countries that are implicated on this. So with the COVID-19 debate, a lot of that has focused on the wet markets selling wildlife, especially wild meat. Do you think that that is a correct narrative that we've been hearing, or is there more to that story?
I think there's definitely more to that story. I think there's, wildlife markets are a cauldron of contagion. They are super spreader events in terms of, because you're just taking so many different animal species from different locations that would never come into contact with each other. You put them into close proximity in awful conditions, and the lowered immune systems, etc., just provide rife opportunity for viruses, for bacteria, for parasites, for all of the different kind of germs, for lack of a better phrase, to spread and emerge. But as I mentioned earlier, that's not the only step. There's wildlife farms where these animals are being commercially captive bred. In many cases, there's no biosecurity. I've been to facilities myself where there's no biosecurity whatsoever. And in addition, there's also the transport. There's the movement of animals in huge numbers, legally and not just illegally, between countries. And this is something where, as we mentioned earlier, even if you've got the best biosecurity protocol in the world, there's still that risk that zoonosis could be spread either to people or brought in with the animals. So this is something that definitely goes beyond just wildlife markets, and it's something we need to take seriously. So please, do sign a petition.
And, you've been talking about this petition. Obviously, this is on, we have it scrolling at the bottom. This is worldanimalprotection.org/G20, where you can sign this petition. I do want to ask you about this petition because you do keep talking about it. And I think it's interesting because you're talking about an outright ban on the wildlife trade, right? And I'm curious if this is really a practical way to deal with what we are all experiencing right now, which is a pandemic. Like, is an outright ban on the entire wildlife trade a practical way to deal with all future pandemics?
So the key thing here is, at the moment, the ask for the G20 is a commitment. So it's to essentially aspire to a bigger goal, rather than the end goal to be a booming, flourishing wildlife trade. Is to have a happy, healthy planet. And it's about raising up to ensure that the sustainable development goals, they're admirable. Peace, stop environmental degradation, to reduce poverty. Those are admirable goals, and we have to follow them. But it's how we get there that I think it needs to be addressed. And it's very much in the first stage here. We're talking about commercial wildlife trade. We're talking about the luxury use of wild animals as exotic pets. As entertainment. That's the aspect that we're looking at. It's that international cross-border first step. And so, in short, it won't be easy getting to a point where we've ended the global commercial wildlife trade, but equally, it's challenging, as we've seen, to regulate it. And I think ultimately, it's that should be our goal. It's a happy, healthy planet that doesn't rely on that, rather than a booming, flourishing wildlife trade that we need to aim for.
Right, and we didn't even get into this as much, Doctor. But I mean, even the consequences that this has on biodiversity loss, right? As we talk more and more about climate change and the climate crisis. I mean, that's a huge part of this conversation, I think, as well. And we want the conversation to continue. Doctor, I do have to ask you. I know we promised we would keep this to half an hour. I could talk to you for days about this, and I do want to make sure that if there's anything that you, as we end this conversation, if there is anything that you feel like I didn't ask you, or the public who are watching haven't asked you yet, that you think is really important for all of us to know and take away from this conversation.
No, I think just that you can make a difference, and don't forget, you can choose to be a consumer, or you can choose not to be a consumer. And when it comes to things like exotic pets, for civet coffee, for wildlife as entertainment, you have that ability to make a difference. And in addition to joining our call for the G20 and that really influential group to make that commitment to shift away and to ban the commercial global wildlife trade. So please do help.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neil DeCruz. For all of you who are watching, I really encourage you to look into the doctor's work, incredible research and data that has been compiled over the years, and such incredible work for World Animal Protection, because that data and that research really brings this, this idea and these emotions that we feel into a really tangible way to look at numbers and inevitably, hopefully, lead to real and lasting change, especially on the global stage as we do approach leaders at events like the G20 Summit. So for all of you who are watching, I just want to remind you that if you do, I know that a lot of you are writing in right now, we're not getting to everybody, but if you do want to participate in this change, this conversation does continue, you can head to World Animal Protection's website. They, as of right now, have over 800,000 signatures, and that's 800,000 voices that are trying to be heard. The goal for World Animal Protection is to have 1 million signatures. So almost there, 200,000 left to go. So I encourage you, if you do want your voice to be heard and you do want to follow up on what Dr. Neil DeCruz says, go check that out, sign that petition. It is going to be delivered to the G20 leaders ahead of their annual Leaders Summit on November 21st and 22nd. Thank you guys all so much. I'm Aliya Jasmine. Feel free to reach out to me on social media and let me know what you thought of this and follow up with your questions or comments. But we thank you all for your participation. Even being here and being part of this dialogue really makes a difference in making the world a better place for animals. So thank you so much, and we'll talk soon. Bye.